Hello, I'm Jackie Miller, introducing today's dialogue, Decolonizing Science Education and Practicing Indigenous Science on behalf of Reconciling Ways of Knowing, Indigenous Knowledge and Science. Joining you today from the Lekwungen Territory, also known as Victoria, BC, where I'm grateful to live, work, and study. Over the past year and a half, as we've brought to you this series of dialogues with the aim of elevating respect for Indigenous ways of knowing within science and policy and decision-making processes informed by science, one of the most consistent themes that has come up in the comments of our speakers and from attendees is the need to decolonize science and science education. Today's dialogue has been a long time coming. We're very pleased to have such an excellent group of speakers to share their wisdom on this important topic with you today. Before we turn to today's dialogue, I have a few quick housekeeping notes. Today's dialogue will run for approximately 2 hours. After formally opening the session and hearing from our panel, the moderator will turn to our project conveners and then to you, our attendees, for your questions. The chat function will be closed during the dialogue, so we ask that you please direct your questions for the speakers through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen, where we will look for your questions during the Q&A part of the program. You can post your questions there at any time during the session once the panel gets started. We'll address all questions as time allows, and we'll synthesize like questions together in order to address as many questions as possible. We will also not be using the hand raise function, so please direct your questions for the speakers through the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. We're recording the session, so anyone unable to participate in the entirety of the session will be able to view it later online, but we're grateful if you can stay with us for the whole time. And now I'm pleased to introduce our moderator for today's dialogue, Corey Wilson. Corey Wilson is Kwakwakwa and serves as the Director of Indigenous Initiatives and Partnerships for the British Columbia Institute of Technology. She's the chair of the National Indigenous Education Committee of Colleges and Institutions, Canada, and chair of the World Federation of Colleges and Polytechnics Indigenous Affinity Group. She has over 20 years of experience in post-secondary education, community development, and legal profession. With a deep commitment to education, she, both formal and informal, she knows innovative and creative solutions are a must to move from reconciliation into reconciliation. Over to you, Corey.
Great, thank you for that, Jackie. Welcome, everybody. I'm very pleased to be coming to you today from the Musqueam Territory, where I've had the good fortune of living and working for about 20 years on their land. And I'm also very pleased to see that it's a beautiful day, knowing that our brothers and sisters in the up the valley have been suffering a great deal with the weather. So I will start today with introducing a video prayer by Mary James of the Lillooet Nation. Somebody will start, Eden will start that.
Gatwalap taka menschnuknuka, kakoshatin squachicha, holkan lamchal kuncha. Oka cookby cooked mulka takam diamha umuntumulak that last eight, amat mich, amako wa oquanstum. Zuminska wa onkosh ama skuncha aus koutska. Lamenwita onkosh katkosh wakui. Cooked mulka cook bitak mujay work ushim, chlomachitukat, kushler otro, kush klushmi, weiss swat kookahaza. Cooked mulka tak mtam momentumata holjati amet mikuli wata nilde cooked.
Great, thank you, Gila Kasla. So welcome again today, everybody. We have, you've seen the agenda, I'm sure, and you also, just to note that all of the speakers, their biographies are on the website or on the link that you've received. So we're gonna get right to it, and as much as I respect and love all the hard work that everybody's done, you can read what they've done, and I think it's really important to have maximize the opportunity to speak with our speakers and hear what they have to say. So we'll start with each panelist giving a 3 to 5 minute talk about their their topic and what their concept and their ideas around decolonizing science and practicing Indigenous science. And of course, this is dialogue number 13 of those of you that have been involved in the series of dialogue workshops with reconciliation, ways of knowing. One of the themes that has emerged is the need to support and provide more support educators and people who are out there in the field. And of course, science is perhaps even more so in the light of the recent environmental challenges that we've been facing. Decolonizing science education and practicing Indigenous science and incorporating it into day-to-day is something that's extremely important. So I'll start with Dr. Lorna Winostis Williams, if you'd like to start, and then I'll go to you, Gregory, and then Sky.
Wanosa and Schwachicha, the Colil what Ula Schwaash and Schnuknukpa. Well, can the Jauna Titamiksha Ilakwanana Motivuxanacha. It's a good day, and thank you, Corey, for taking care of us. And I just want to also say that the prayer was by Kakusha Mary James from my home community, and she prayed. She sent a prayer and an ask for our care and the care of our lands and the waters that we drink, and that all goes well today. I'm an educator. I have been for most of my life, I spent time in every form of education that was part of our lives. Residential school, I spent time there, and in Indian day school. I went to Catholic school, public school when we were able to, and that was for me. It was good for me to have all those experiences, because then they've informed what I've later brought to my role as a teacher and a professor. And my work has been largely in three areas. One is a revitalization of our languages. I've worked with Indigenous peoples across Canada and around the world. So it's a large part of my work. I began that work in our own home community as our language was beginning to shift, and we noticed what was happening. And so when I was young, very young, and energetic, I had the blessing to be able to work on bringing our languages into a school. And then the other part of my work, a large part of my work, has been in understanding the effects of colonization on learning. And that work took me to Israel, because that is a place where people were trying to understand this. And then the other part of my work is the inclusion of Indigenous knowledge in all subject areas. So beginning probably with social studies, to bring our history and our knowledge to that curriculum. And that was a real challenge. And I learned a great deal in trying to do this. It took us 40 years to be able to bring even our existence into the area of social studies in K-12. And then it took us another 10 years to bring our stories into literature. And then it's taken another 20 years, and we're still working at it to have our knowledge systems to be a part of the understanding of science. And it's not a form of science, but it's to bring our knowledge into that area. And I guess the other area in related to that is bringing our ways of teaching and learning into the area of education. And because it's often thought that we didn't have a system. As Indigenous people, we didn't have a system, but we had a very carefully thought out and a really successful system of preparing the next generation. And so this is something that I've been introducing and trying to understand, and so that people could bring that into education. So those are the areas of my work.
Absolutely fantastic. Thank you for that long career as well. And you reminded me as you were talking of I was talking to a language speaker from back east, and they were telling me their definition of education in their language means to study the sky and to study the earth. So that is about the whole completion. And certainly your progress and the work you've done in integrating Indigenous knowledge from social studies to science is commendable. Thank you for that. Now we'll go to Dr. Gregory Cjete, if you'd like to start.
Sengi Samo, greetings from Taylor country in New Mexico. It's really a pleasure to have this this time with all of you to share some thoughts and perspectives on science education. I'm not sure if you know that I really trained as a field biologist originally, and my intention actually was to go full-time into science, but I stopped off at the Institute of American Indian Arts to take a year offer of teaching, and got hooked by the teaching bug and have been a teacher ever since. So I'm going about 48 years now, actually, of active teaching in some role or another, including also administration, which is more than 30 years, administrating some kind of program. I began my career essentially at the Institute, and I was given a very interesting challenge that actually has formed my work ever since. And that challenge was I originally was brought in to really replace a former science teacher at the Institute of American Indian Arts. At the time, in 1974, I was the Institute had actually a high school, and so I was brought in to teach high school science, thinking I would be there only a year or two. But the president of the school, Lloyd New, invited me to come to his office early on. And we had a long discussion about science education, about the students' feelings about science. And apparently students had come to his office to complain, to protest how science was being taught at the Institute of American Indian Arts. Their feeling was that there was no science in Native, tradition, and that there was, and then why should they have to take a science credit, if they were going to an art school, because the Institute was an art school. And so, and on the other hand, of course, the teacher I was replacing was a veteran of the Bureau of Indian Affairs schools, and his style of teaching was, the old methodologies, and really no real relevance the students felt to their lives. So I was asked and challenged at that time really to make a change in the curriculum. And given the resources by the president, Lloyd New, to actually embark on I would call it a quest now, to reform science education or teaching of science courses at the Institute of American Indian Arts. And so that began my journey, if you will, as both a science teacher and also a researcher of science education. I did create a curriculum at the Institute of American Indian Arts, which later became this book, which is Igniting the Sparkle, an Indigenous Science Education Curriculum. So that's my doctoral dissertation. But of course, in researching and implementing a culturally relevant science at IIA, I was introduced to the amazing world of Native knowledge, Native perspectives. Although I was coming from a community which was very traditional, still spoke our languages, it was really an eye-opening experience to see the length and breadth of Indigenous knowledge from all over the world, actually. And how it was also marginalized and also really not a part of not only Western forms of education, but also not a part of our own Native education. And so that began my quest at that time to really change things. And I used my tool as a teacher. My advocacy, again, I have to give a lot of credit to students I've taught over the years who also acted as advocates once they understood why it was important to bring Indigenous knowledge and perspectives into mainstream Western education in appropriate ways, but nonetheless to bring that knowledge, that history, that tradition into the lives of the many students, many Native students. And so science became one of the areas that, of course, I concentrated on. The arts, being from the Institute of American Indian Arts as a teacher, also a self-taught artist, became and continues to be a very important element of this transformation, if you will, that we're in the midst of. So that brings me, I went from the Institute to the University of New Mexico, became director of Native Studies there, and was director for about 18 years before I retired this past June 20th, 2020. But I still continue to be active in advocating for, the changes and then the importance of science education and how Indigenous knowledge can be appropriately used to enhance not only science education, but certainly to begin to build a foundation for the next generation. And probably now more than ever before, our understanding of science along with the integration of our own Indigenous knowledge systems becomes paramount, as we begin to face the challenges of global climate change, which impact Indigenous peoples in so many different kinds of ways. We are indeed the canaries in the cage, and are facing, major issues as I speak all over the world, with regard to fresh water, shelter, food, the sanctity and also the viability of our lands and our waters, so that we need a new kind of science that really balances the Western science view, which itself is powerful, yes, but it's not balanced. It doesn't have a sense of conscience for relationship and responsibility, I think, to people and also to the land, to the earth itself. So that's what we as Indigenous people bring to the table. Although it's been ridiculed and it's been, given all sorts of, derogatory references in the past. I think finally many science people in science are beginning to realize the importance of Indigenous knowledge and bringing that forward into the teaching of science for all. So with that, thank you again for the invitation to be here, and look forward to the rest of our conversations.
Well, thank you for your contributions that you've made almost 40 plus years, 48 years, you said, contributions to advancing Indigenous knowledge and science. And I think, quite frankly, the both of you advancing simply Indigenous knowledge in any type of education, as well as Indigenous ways of knowing and being. So thank you for that. And I think somebody that's probably hoping to follow in your footsteps, though not quite has reached the 40-year career mark, but hopefully she will, of course, inspired and walk down the path that the two of you paved, is Sky Augustine.
CM na siya ikwanasitlam nala ainta hwasyanyan tanitsanalt. It's so good to be here with all of you today. My Hokkamiam name is Hwasyanyan, and I'm from the Marston and Sylvie families from the Staminas Nation on my mother's side. And I'm of Swedish and Scottish and Irish ancestry on my father's side. And I grew up close in my ancestral lands and waters. And today I'm joining from Lekwungen speaking lands. I am an Indigenous scholar and a marine ecologist. And when I was growing up, I really wanted to be a scientist and figure out how to protect our oceans. I grew up really aware of the perils that we were facing, and felt like it was my obligation and or deep sense of responsibility and honor to be able to make sure that my kids and my grandkids had the opportunity to watch the salmon runs and engage in food fish every year. And growing up, I think that, and even when I began university, I felt like I had a choice to make sometimes around between the opportunity to learn my language and to learn ancestral ways of knowing and relating to the land, and to kind of be a scientist and be able to engage in that world. And I think I've kind of felt that split until I got this summer job that was my mission for the summer, was to learn as much as I could about these places called clam gardens. And I didn't know anything about clam gardens at the time. But that summer, what that looked like was me spending time on beaches with my elders, learning language and learning all about the ways that our ancestors have cared for the beaches and the seaweeds and the kelps and all of the creatures that live under the water that we don't get to see all the time, as well as our forests and our meadows. And I got to learn some of the kind of techniques and skills that we use within ecology to study populations of clams and habitat structure and all of those things. Now, if any of you were like me at the time and don't know what a clam garden is, clam gardens are these ancestral beaches that are found from Alaska down to Washington State, all along the Pacific Northwest, that were constructed by our ancestors by building a rock wall at the very low tide line of the beach, which will effectively shift the slope of the beach and make it flatter. This expands the area for clams to grow and increases their growth rates by 2 to 4 times. And so they are these incredibly productive places that have been cared for for many millennia by our ancestors and sustainably harvested from, not just for clams, for all sorts of different seafoods. And so these places are evidence of this incredible feat of engineering that our ancestors have done, and then this sustainable kind of use and cultivation of all of our important food species, as well as our language and our stories, continuously, in some cases for over 3,500 years. And so this kind of began initiated the next kind of 12 years of my life, which has been focused around bringing these beaches back to life again. And to bring these beaches back to life again, it requires that we understand how our ancestors worked. It also requires that we understand how our oceans and knowledge and species are functioning today, because sometimes it's a little bit different. And in order to do that, we are bringing people back onto beaches again to reconnect people with our ancestral places and care for these places as they've been cared for since time immemorial. And so that means bringing elders and youth onto these beaches together. Sometimes it means helping youth contextualize themselves in place and time. And it means that we get to kind of investigate and learn together through story, through song, and through ecology and geomorphology. And so we have all these kind of different ways that we get to try to learn from the past and also bring some of these lessons into the ways that we are caring for our foods and hopefully our future generations.
Fantastic. Thank you. Being a girl from the coast as well, I had no idea about clam gardens. I really appreciate that. And that's clearly evidence of Indigenous understanding of growth and life cycles and all of those types of things and what it takes to make a healthy population. So one of the questions, and all of you referenced it at one point, is the idea that people don't recognize Indigenous knowledge as a science. Though, of course, as Indigenous people, we know that science, or our concept of science and understanding Indigenous knowledge, is really holistic. It's interdependent. We wouldn't have survived if we only studied physics or if we only studied chemistry. As Sky said, we had to understand the waves and the life cycles and the things that depend on that. So if you had, I'll ask all panelists, if you had, it's lack of a better word, an elevator pitch, when somebody indicates that, well, what is the connection? I don't see the connection. What do you say to someone that doesn't think Indigenous people, Indigenous knowledge is on the same level, or even maybe not even in the same arena as Indigenous or as mainstream Western science? I'll go to you, Dr. Gregory.
Oh, yeah. So thank you for that question. Actually, it's a question I've been asked many times over the years, and it still is a question that continues to be asked. First of all, I consider, having been, through a science curriculum in a higher education institution, I see why some would ask that question, because there's absolutely nothing in science curriculums, at least at that time. There's a little more now, but at that time, there was nothing that referred in any way to anything other than Western tradition and Western ways of knowing, and nothing about Indigenous anything, So individual scientists who are educated in that context, unless they have themselves the wherewithal or some kind of situation pushes them into really questioning their form of education, never experience the other. So science education in that sense becomes a closed system, a closed cultural system, and if there's no alternative examples, it conditions you to think that that's the only truth and the only way to practice science. And certainly that is compounded by Western society as a whole and Western education as a whole, which also, chants that same mantra. And so anything other than Western tradition, Western thought, is excluded from the paradigm, if you will, of the science education and the education of scientists. Yes. And so their condition, that question is all actually almost inevitable from individuals who are conditioned in that way. The first thing really is to address it by helping address the ignorance, the underlying ignorance. Of course, scientists don't like to be called ignorant, in any shape or form, but because science is also Western science especially, is very egotistical, and that gets into the social construct of science. But usually they get angry at first, when that is challenged. But if you continue the challenge and say, well, scientists themselves have documented all of what I'm saying about Indigenous science, about our traditions, about the clam beds that Sky just mentioned, about in the Southwest, about our forms of terra farming, dryland farming, and crop rotation, and actually forming the environment to be. And this was actually a common practice, wherever Indigenous people lived for a period of time. They had a relationship and knew practical ecology, practical understandings of plants and animals, and the nature of the soil, so that they were practicing scientists anyway. And they found ways to sustain and nourish and actually even extend, environments in ways that we are just finding out about today. So I point to the evidence that is already there, that it was already created, has been created by Western scientists largely. Now there are more Native scientists doing this work, but largely by non-Native scientists that really, paint a completely different picture of how Native science has worked in the past. And so that would be my response, and those scientists that are open-minded, will actually, move forward with looking into those things. I guess I'm more, it's more obvious to me that it's the institutions themselves. And now we're getting at the administration of science programs and the administrators who administrate in science programs that become more problematic. The scientists themselves will find ways to teach themselves, but not necessarily at the administrative level, because it's a system that is vested in certain kinds of ways.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry, and we'll that definitely is. It's a system, it's an institution, it's a legacy, it's a act of colonization. We'll get into that for sure. Thank you for that answer, and definitely it's as you indicated, an issue that we're still trying to deal with. Dr. Williams, how do you answer that?
Well, science education has been something that we've been grappling with. And, I began my education career in my home community because my community, Mount Currie, was the first community in BC to take over its education system in the early 70s. And but I think we were certainly already working on our understanding our relationship with the land and our knowledge prior to that, and then we brought that into the development of our school. And so I'll begin with just the story that about my mother was the healer in our community. And so she looked after everybody, and their health, and, she performed surgeries, and when anybody was ill, they would come to get her. And, as is natural in families and in our communities, I was being mentored to follow her path. And so I would, I was always encouraged to tag along and, and to help out and to just be there. And so I began to learn about our medicinal plants. And the old ladies used to take me out into the forest to teach me about the plants, and how to pick them for medicine. But one of the things that really stuck to me was that this was in the 60s, was how our lands, we had already been restricted to very small portions of our territory, and some of our plants, for example, and our food, our food plants, our medicinal plants, were now in what were assigned as parks, and we couldn't access them. But one of the things that that really became clear was because of what was happening to our lands, the plants themselves were changing. Like one of the things that the women who were teaching me and who I was working with, they would go to a place where usually there would be certain plants and there would be none. And it's because of what both the provincial and the federal governments were doing to to our landforms, and so there was a change, and we could see the change. We really certainly felt the change, and then when we started our school, we asked our community, what do you want your children to know from this school? And a very clear message was, we want our children to know their history. We want our children to know the land. We want our children to know who they are as Litwatim, and they need to know how to live on the land. But in this changed land that we were now living on, and they also said, but we want our children to be able to know the other world too, and to be able to go back and forth without losing a sense of who they are, that's a huge task. And so when we began the school, that's where we began our language work, our work around Indigenous knowledge, but also, how do you bring together the world of the Western world and our Lil'wat world? How do you make those two worlds work together? And how do you help people to cross from one to the other, and without getting lost? And that's and so in our school, we hired two people from India, one to be a science teacher and the other to be the math teacher in our high school. That was a real, I think that was really smart on the part of my family, on the part of my community, because these people had a very different understanding, and they had a different of teaching and science, and colonization. They had an understanding of that. And so our request to them was, to the science teacher, to bring the science, the Western science, how do we bring that onto the land? Not how to bring Indigenous knowledge to the Western science, but how do you bring Western science to our understanding of our relationships on the land? And so the science classes the walls were broken down, and the students went out and learned. They learned at the fishing camp. They learned, in the mountains, and in the fields, and so that was, I think, that began my understanding, because I was really fearful of science, and I tried to go, I wanted to go into medicine, but I couldn't do science. I couldn't do math very well. And I did go into medicine, and I realized that the world of medicine in the Western world and the world of medicine in my mother's world, where I could see clearly the difference. And so that's what led me, I think, to the work of to trying to understand how these two worlds can coexist. And so when I became the director of Aboriginal education, it was Aboriginal at that time, Indigenous now, education in British Columbia, we tried to include Indigenous knowledge in the areas of science. And we got such a pushback from science teachers. And and I think that points to what Gregory talked about the closed system and the system itself not being able to be open and to to any kind of thinking beyond what they were learning, what they were being taught in university, and what was acceptable, what was written in the science textbooks. And so it's going to require, it has required very focused and consistent pressure on the whole system of education itself to to breach the walls, because there's significantly high and strong walls around what is considered to be Indigenous, what is considered to be science knowledge.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you for that, and your early work in creating a school that obviously is outside the box and very different, but yet in many ways the way education should be, as reflective of the environment and the culture and the language of its location. Sky, being currently in the academy doing your graduate work, how do you get your peers, supervisors, colleagues to understand that connection between science and Indigenous knowledge?
Oh, thanks so much. And thank you both, Dr. Cjete and Dr. Williams, for all of the work that you've done in this area. I feel so honored to be able to reap the benefits of all of that. When I am having these kinds of conversations, one of the things one of the ways that I think about this or talk about this is that science is kind of a method and an epistemology that we use to try to understand the world. And it's a collection of a systematic way of observing, of asking questions, of experimenting, tracking outcomes, adjusting, and making decisions. And when I look at the evidence of our ancestors and I look at the wisdom that our people have left behind and continue to hold today and carry forward, I see all of those same things. We have observed, we ask questions, we experiment, we track outcomes, we adapt. I think that, when I think about our ancestors, I think that they're some of the most brilliant at practicing adaptive management, conservation, agriculture science, all of these areas that we think of as being kind of parts of Western science. And I love, one of the reasons I love clam gardens is because they provide such a clear example of each of these things. Clam gardens have been around for over 3,500 years and used continuously. We can see that those rock walls have continued to be adjusted to changing sea levels over the entire duration. We have our ancestors have developed ingenious methods for detecting harmful algal blooms, for setting aside specific places and beaches for the years when food is hard to come by. And when I think about that, and when I spend time on these places, and then I look at the kind of situations that we're facing, even in the last 2 weeks in British Columbia, I think that there's a lot that we can learn from our dominant society about preparing for and adapting to changing conditions, and conferring resilience to our social systems, our supplies, our supply routes, and the ways that we are looking after our more than human kin.
Thank you for that. So on that, Sky, going forward, or in light of, even just the last few days for us, though, of course, many have been suffering in British Columbia and around the world for longer than that, due to climate change and consumption. And, we can bring in the whole economic system as well, but we don't have time for that today. What do you hope people can take, if there was perhaps one thing people could take from Indigenous, not take, if they allowed Indigenous people to share, because I think we've always been willing to share, but people haven't taken us up on our offer. What is the one thing you think that you hope to see, in the next 5 years, 10 years, that would be different, or would be evidence of acknowledgement of Indigenous knowledge and validation of that?
Oh, such a good question, Corey. And I don't know if I can pick just one.
Well, yes, just for the sake of time. One or two.
I think that if I were to kind of summarize it in one piece, I think that it would be to kind of lead with humility. And I think that this is a teaching that I have learned, been given, and I think is something that a lot of us could use to continue to grow. And when I think about the best scientists, I also think some of those people are the most humble and open to learning and open to curiosity. And I think that when we lead with humility, we're able to be more open and experimental with the ways that we consider information, consider shifting power dynamics, and consider whose voices we're centering. I think that when we're able to gather in circle or set a table and make sure that all the right people are there and are able to bring the best available knowledge and understanding about the world, then we are so rich. We are so rich. And with that, I think that we are able, with that kind of richness that we are able to set at the table, I hope that we'll be able to find some of the answers to the most complicated questions that we're facing right now.
Yes, thanks for that. So there's a lot of hope in that as well, right? And it's going to take everybody together. We're stronger. Dr. Cjete, I know I've been using examples in British Columbia, but I certainly know in your area, in your territory, there's also some major crisis, whether it's health, whether it's education or climate as well. What is the, and again, I know for the sake of time, what is the one thing you really, if people could get this one thing or two things, what is it that they need to get?
I think they need to get respect and really have to understand the deeper levels of relationship. And that relationship also brings with it responsibility. And through that responsibility, you begin to resonate with your community in ways that nourish it and sustain it. And so that's kind of the Indigenous teaching wherever you find it in the world. I'm concerned, part of my concern certainly is to enhance the education of Native people, with science, and because science was a part of our traditions and part of our ways of life, although we express it in different ways. But I'm concerned about our own communities because of colonization, because of Western education. Many of our communities, superficially view our ways of knowing, but when it comes down to the nitty-gritty, they defer to the Western view consistently. And that happens in health, that happens in education, that happens in the ways we view our community. So for me, community is the medium and the message. And that has many meanings in many different ways to view it. But community really was the ways, and this community, because we're talking about community knowledge when we're talking about Indigenous knowledge, we're talking about community knowledge, and that knowledge was situated and contexted and also conveyed and transferred through mechanisms within the community. Once our communities begin to defer, like education, forced deferment, of our traditional forms of education to the Western education system, we lost a great deal. And today we really have to relearn, I think, a lot of our traditions of community. We certainly have done work with identity. We've done work with certainly with the political sphere of self-determination, but I don't think we've done enough work about with regard to community and community within the context of Native peoples themselves. So what I see here in the Southwest is that many of the systems that were in place, the state, the federal, and even the tribal systems actually failed, with regard to many of the key basic issues and necessities with regard to COVID. Although they tried to cope, they essentially failed. They weren't able to perform. Mm-hmm. And had we had, like in the turn of the century, the turn of the 20th century, when we had the last big pandemic, the Spanish flu, community was still very strong, very self-reliant, and even during the here in the States, the Great Depression, people, yes, were poor, but they were able to sustain themselves because they could live off the land and live on less. And in many cases, our Indigenous communities are no longer in positions to be able to do that as they once were. So we have to work, within our own communities. So I'm really advocating what I call traditional community-based education. I'm moving it away from the school, away from the institution. Although you still have to deal with that. It's a constant battle, but the real battle is really, I think, to reestablish our communality and deepen it in ways, because that's going to ultimately, ensure our sustainability and our survival in the long term. The challenges we face can't be handled by individuals alone. They have to be acted on communally. And so we have to facilitate ways through education to facilitate this communality in ways that allow us to once again sustain and also once again adapt to the changes that are very rapid and happening as we speak. And so the community-based education, of which land-based education is one part of, but there's also the social, aspect of that within our communities themselves has to be really reestablished. We're trying to reestablish community schools, my own community as well, but being hampered left and right by the institutional schooling policies of the state, of the federal government, BIA. And we're not really able to completely realize that communal schoolness, that we want, that includes, as Lorna mentioned in her community, the language, the traditions, the culture. It's so difficult to do that when you're having to deal with the Western institutions. So I'm advocating for the communities to take over their education of their community, through themselves, but it's going to take some real rewiring of our current tribal government structures, for example, that still defer to the Western system in everything that they do, including governance.
Yeah. So both internally, it's going to take dismantling and working together, as well as externally, right, within the institution.
Right. It's a two-way. Yeah.
All of us again doing our part. And Dr. Williams, just going to you on that, the whole idea again of practicing Indigenous knowledge, or practicing science with an Indigenous knowledge lens, and not just a lens, but an actual foundational, it's the core. What advice do you have, or what is the one piece that you'd give?
Well, the hugest barrier and challenge that we face in being able to do that is that the way that science is taught and thought about is very reductionist and thinking, and and also very siloed, and so all of our institutions are constructed in that way. And so, when we're in the Indigenous world, it's very interconnected whole, like there it's and it's about connecting, making the relationships in kind of, and seeing the bigger picture. And it's really hard to be able to learn in that way, and to work with knowledge in that way, in the systems that we're working with. And but I think that, and that's something that I've tried to shift, in the university, and I can see that it can be done, but it's going to take some time. And I think there is an openness to being able to do that, to begin to go in that direction. But there's still lots of resistance. And so it's really how we approach our being in the world that we need to be able to build that into, into how we do things and where we do things, and so that in our knowledge systems can be a part of it. And one of the other big challenges, I would say, is our own devaluing of our knowledge systems. And we need to really address that. And because for centuries now we've been told that our way of being in the world, our knowledge, is less than, it's not of value, it's old, it's and it's not modern, it's not civilized. And we need to be able to really come up with some good arguments about why this knowledge system is of value, not just to us, but to the world.
Yes, absolutely. And I think that's part of it. Again, how do we undo the legacy of colonization and colonialism that has, obviously from residential, that, as Murray Sinclair says, it's education that got us into this mess. It's education that will have to get us out of this, and perhaps even in many ways, more importantly, science. Not just science education itself, or rethink of that, but the inclusion of Indigenous people in science and our knowledge, as well as more Indigenous people going into science. So we have about 5 minutes left, and maybe I'll just go to each of you. And I guess, what is your hope? What is your dream? I'll go to you, Dr. Cjete.
Well, my hope for the future is that we can find a way to bring together these two very different ways of being in the world, and make them work for us. We're going to need to do that. As Indigenous people, we're going to need to do that. Non-Indigenous people are going to have to do that. And so it comes down to I know that Winona LaDuke, sort of coined the phrase, what kind of ancestor do you want to be?
Yes.
What kind of ancestor do you want to be? And so it's about, for me, it's about legacy that I leave. My last two books have been really just publishing the work of my my own doctoral students, as they're struggling in the world, just as Sky struggled as graduate students struggled to get their PhD in a system that really didn't understand them, that was not built for them. And they still struggle, even though they've gotten positions. So I think for me, it's really about, that very important notion, because Indigenous sciences are sustainability sciences. They were about maintaining the people through time, through generations, sustaining them, and extending life in the life-centeredness of the world. And so I hope that philosophy, which I think is taking on worldwide in a variety of different ways, continues to grow and evolve, and will be inclusive of what we're talking about today, which is, how to do science better. I think this form of science education, if it ever gets underway, I know how to do it. I've taught others how to do it. It's doable. It's not as they would say, rocket science, but it's doable. It's just that the system and the institutions and the powers that be resist it. They don't want it because it forces them to transform their own thinking in ways that they don't want to do.
Yeah. Very important points. Thanks for that. Being a good ancestor. And I would extend that to all of us as human beings. We all need to be good ancestors, and extending the knowledge, as you said, even rocket science. I know there was a Native American astronaut. So as Indigenous people, we have the ability to succeed not only in mainstream, if you will, and of course, bringing our whole selves, our whole knowledge systems to the structures and institutions while fighting to change them. Thank you for all of the work that you've done in that area. And I'll go to you, Dr. Williams.
Well, I think that and I get to this from the work that I've been doing in Indigenous languages. There are now scholars at universities who are studying, for example, our languages and the work of, their work in their home communities with their languages. And this knowledge is now available. And I think that as places open up to create spaces for our people to be able to do this work, our knowledge is accessible. It's out there, and so I'm really hopeful when I see young people who are taking this up and learning and having the courage to be able to do the kind of work that we need. And so I sure, as an old person, looking and listening to these young people, I'm really encouraged.
Again, going back to that idea of hope as well, right? And both of you have just mentioned too, the fact that this knowledge is available. It just has to be picked up. It's not as though we have to discover or demonstrate that it exists. It exists if the rest of the world wants to pick it up and wants to embrace it and wants to use it. And I appreciate as well your longstanding work on language, because language obviously is indicative or reflects the values of a society, the values of a people, of a culture, of a nation, that reflects the land upon which it flourished. So thank you for that. And thank you again for all of the work that you've done as well. And Sky, our up and coming scholar.
I hope to live in the world yeah, tough acts to follow. I want to live in the world that Dr. Cjete and Dr. Williams have been dreaming and creating. Yeah, I think that I want to live in a world that where we see Indigenous science upheld and centered in so many more spaces. And I think that looks like centering elders' voices, even when there's difficult trade-offs. I think it means making space for story and the stories that allow us to contextualize ourselves in our places and in our time and with our responsibilities as future ancestors, Dr. Cjete, like you said. Dr. Williams, you were talking about how Indigenous science and Indigenous knowledge teach us how to be like good humans and in good relationship. And one of the things that makes me think about is how, some of my teachers have taught me that it's really important to watch children because children are the closest to the spirit world and can teach us so much. And I think that that's also the kind of world that I want to see, where we're able to honor the children and build a good life for them, and the wisdom that comes from curiosity and openness.
Fantastic. Thank you, Sky. I think we all agree that you have a bright future, and we look forward to seeing what you will do. And I really appreciate, my hands go up to all of you for the knowledge that you've shared. Of course, we could go on for quite a bit of time, longer than this, but some of the key things, of course, is that centering of Indigenous knowledge, respect, becoming a good ancestor, that balance, pushing against the systems, not just the institutions, but also focusing on creating things within our own communities that are land-based, that are holistic in their teachings and in the knowledge that they share. And I would say for, I guess, non-Indigenous scholars or scientists as well, the recommendations that you made is for them is to do, I guess, what scientists are supposed to do, is do further inquiry and further investigations and acceptance of not predetermining the outcome, but valuing all information and all sources. So I really appreciate all of the work that you've done, and thank you for joining us. And I trust you're going to stay on for our next little bit that we'll be doing. So now we'll be moving on to the reconciling ways of knowing, pardon me for that, of knowing. And we're going to hear from, okay, sorry, Don. So I'm trying to manage the technology as well at the same time, but just while everybody's getting their camera on the next speakers, just so you know, we will be having a question and answer. It was brought up before. Put your questions in the question and answer box, and at some point they'll be emailed to me, and we will get to your questions with the speakers. So introducing the next group of speakers, we have Kilslai Costing, Miles Richardson, Dr. Nancy Turner, and Dr. David Suzuki. So we'll have about 8 minutes or so. I'm not going to time you, Miles, but 8 minutes or so, where if you can just share your reflections on the previous panel, and of course your reflections on decolonizing science and practicing Indigenous science. And I'll start with you, Miles.
Thank you, Corey, and thank the panel for a really stimulating discussion. I just want to jump right into it. Dr. Williams, you talk about science being, an organized system of knowledge and somewhat closed, but traditional knowledge or others haven't seen your people's knowledge as systems. And, I've had really direct experience with your people's knowledge and systems and conveying that. And I know that's where I got to know David Suzuki really well, is when your people, under the leadership of Chief Ruby Dunstan, stood up and protected the Stein Valley. That was based on your traditional knowledge, on your knowledge of the way to do things and in your territory, and what was necessary to have a future for all of it. Imagine of all those people who experienced what happened this summer with the fires and the floods in the last week, had listened to your people when you stood up and said, let's protect the Stein Valley. And that's from your traditional knowledge, that's from your system, your ways of putting them forward. And thank God there was a little bit of sense, and at least the Stein was protected. I mean, I know you probably wanted a lot more changes than that, but that's a really dramatic example of those knowledge systems. And I don't know if I'd like to hear more. What kind of systems do your people have for transferring your traditional knowledge and in your education systems? I mean, every one of our nations has them. Yours certainly has demonstrated that you do.
Did you want me to respond to this?
I guess I didn't make the question clear enough. I was just wanting you to share knowledge systems that your people have. I mean, you know, others don't see it too clearly. It's an opportunity to explain to them those systems that you have to transmit knowledge and traditional education systems.
Well, as I was saying earlier, you know, that our system was, you know, throughout a person's life, that there are the knowledge, the people who hold knowledge in certain areas mentored the next generation. And oftentimes you don't even, you know, it's done in a way that people don't even notice they're being directed and mentored. And that's it, and so that still exists, but no, but people aren't, people haven't been really talking about how that takes place. And so this whole way of, you know, I guess the closest word would be in English would be the, you know, the apprenticing and mentorship models. And so that knowledge is passed down. I think the other way that people don't realize is it's through the stories that are told, and the way that songs are shared, and people don't realize how much knowledge is in those songs and in those stories that are told. So for example, there's a song in that's sung often by, you know, now still in my community, that came to one of our chiefs, and he was being instructed by a stream. He fell asleep, and the stream began to tell him stories and to teach him about different things. And so, you know, that was now many generations, but that song is still performed by our young people. And so it's still part of our knowledge system. And it instructs us on how to have a relationship, you know, with the streams and with the water systems in our communities, how to care for them, and how we're a part of their life, its life, as it's a part of our life, and in a reciprocal way. And so these stories and these songs are still brought to the land. And so, you know, our young people, every fall, the elders take the young people, you know, to the Stein Valley to walk the land, to and just to remember and to care for and to have a relationship with that land. And one of the other things, for example, is when our babies are born, when their belly button falls, you know, comes off, we take it to the land. And because we believe, and we don't, you know, the baby is not told where their belly button is going to be, but it's, you know, placed in a special place by the elders, you know, the older people in the family, and it's so that the child, this newborn child, will always have a connection to the land. Their spirit is there. And you know, it's that kind of caring for, you know, that relationship, you know, that foundation that's a part of all of our lives, that continues to be. So in those practices, in the passing down of knowledge and through the stories and the songs and knowing how to be able to listen to the land. It's that probably is the greatest ability that a person can acquire. Thank you for sharing that, Miles.
Oh, thank you. Am I out of time, Corey? Oh, you're on.
Yeah, well, you will see how it goes. We'll go to Dr. Suzuki now.
Oh, thank you. This has been such an important meeting today, and I've been thinking about it a lot because I'm trained as a geneticist, and genetics started in 1900, so it's a very young science, and geneticists are all pumped up with, oh, look at the progress that we've had in less than 200 years, and you know, all the big things. I watched a program last night about the CRISPR, you know, this new technology for substituting genes. And I was just shocked at the conversation of the scientists who are talking not only about curing disease, but about breeding a better kind of humanity, you know, and the models they were talking about had nothing to do with the people I know, Japanese people. But anyway, I don't want to go into that. The important thing here is to recognize traditional knowledge is not science. It is so much bigger than science, and to call any traditional area of knowledge science, to me, diminishes it. The challenge now is for science and scientists to recognize how flawed and limited it is. Traditional knowledge is knowledge accumulated by successes, observations, failures over thousands of years, and that knowledge base is fundamental for survival. The fact that you have Indigenous people with a knowledge base that has maintained them for 10 millennia or more is a tribute to how powerful that knowledge base is for survival. Science is a radically different way. As Lorna mentioned, most of modern science now is not based on the kind of observation that Darwin did. It's now based on reductionism, which is to focus and zero in. And it's a very powerful way of doing that. But in the process of focusing, you lose sight of the context within which that bit of nature that you're studying exists, why it's even important. And then scientists aspire to objectivity. You know, you can't get involved. You can't get emotionally involved in what you're studying because that colors it. You know, Jane Goodall, when she went and did her groundbreaking studies, and I might mention that until Jane went out and looked at chimpanzees where they lived, it was assumed by biologists who are reductionists that if you had a chimpanzee in a cage, that you could learn everything there was to know about a chimpanzee by studying it in the cage. Jane said, I'm going to go and see where they actually exist. And what she discovered was something so fundamentally different from the caged animal that the cage stuff was irrelevant. But Jane committed the great sin of giving them names. And right away they said, see, she's emotionally involved. I mean, how can you take her work seriously? That's not science. And it's true. It's not science. It is traditional ways of knowing. People would never think of looking at something objectively. They're celebrating the earth, the basis of who we are and our lives comes from Mother Earth itself. And so you celebrate that, you honor that, you respect it. But scientists, it's just, oh, I'm just looking at it objectively and drill down. So it's the focus today. Science began as just a way of knowing, how does God do this? A way of discovering God's bits of handiwork. But now science is increasingly looked to solve our problems, to be driven, so that for most scientists, their activity is driven by a desire for personal achievement. You get all kinds of rewards, you know, promotions and raises, and you might even win a Nobel Prize if you're really good. But science increasingly is supported by governments to drive the economic system that the governments want to support. And that's very, very different, it seems to me, from a context where your knowledge is important for you, to a way of knowing how to live with Mother Earth, who is the one that is the source of all of our lives. Radically different context of the way that we're doing it. What is all of this knowledge for that we're getting for science? Today, increasingly, we're saying, oh, they have to go in, our kids in university have to learn science so they can go into use computers and all of this technology. We're going to go into genetic engineering, geoengineering. But, you know, I've given a number of lectures to elementary school kids. And when I ask them simple things like, when you turn on the tap, where does your water come from? They don't know. And when I tell them Lake Ontario, I say, when you flush the toilet, where does that go? They don't know. And they're shocked when I tell them, well, it goes out in treatment and then it goes back out into Lake Ontario, where the water that you're drinking comes from. I ask them, when you turn on the lights in Toronto, where does the electricity come from? They don't know. And if you ask them, when you put the garbage on the curb and it goes away, where does it go? You know, they don't know. What about the food? Most of the food that our kids are eating is processed now. Where does it come from? You know, we don't ask questions like, in the middle of February in northern Canada, where do those tomatoes and lettuce and apples, where are they coming from? Canada's a northern country. All of our food was once alive. Do you know that? Where was it grown? How was it grown? I mean, the most fundamental things that we should know, it seems to me, to live in the way that Indigenous people have for thousands of years. Those questions are not taught. The answers are not taught in our schools. So I'm wondering, what the hell is an education for? Where Dr. Cjete is saying, well, you know, we've got to find a way of bringing these two areas of knowledge together. And Lorna is saying that we need Indigenous knowledge for the context within which knowledge is used. That's what we need. And the recognition of that importance comes when we realize science right now is leading us down a very, very dangerous road. So, sorry, I just had written a whole speech here in response to the input that you've had, but thank you very much for the contributors here for what you've given us.
Well, I think your points are very well taken, and thank you for that, and thank you for that sharing. And I think it is reflective of what Dr. Cjete and Dr. Williams and soon to be Dr. Augustine were saying as well, is that Indigenous knowledge is something bigger and greater than science. It is something that's interconnected, interdependent, and core to simple humanity and to Mother Earth and to all of the systems that have led us to this day. Dr. Nancy Turner, would you like to make some comments?
Thank you very much, Corey. I just want to say how much I've enjoyed and appreciated these presentations. What a wonderful panel and a wonderful moderator. Just so important. And I'll just make a couple of quick observations. The idea of teaching through stories is so important in Indigenous knowledge. And I'm reminded of a story that has particular relevance that was actually told by an elder from Dr. Williams' community in Mount Currie, Baptiste Ritchie. He told this story originally in the Lil'wat language to linguist Leon Swoboda, and it's called in English, burning mountainsides for better crops. And it embodies so much knowledge and so much ecological knowledge, cultural knowledge, and it's about the traditional practice of using fire to create particular successional stages in forests that are productive for berries and root vegetables. And he goes into great detail about which species are encouraged by fire. And it's one of the most really detailed accounts of the use of fire and how important it has been. And yet fire was banned by the government back when Smokey the Bear was born. And that was a long time ago. And so this knowledge hasn't been able to be carried forward in a normal way of actually practicing it. And it's a legacy that he left to provide this knowledge so that people can try to bring it up to date and maybe prevent some of these terrible fires that we've had in British Columbia. And then another just very small point, the notion of knowledge embodied in language is so important. And as a botanist who is also a student of Indigenous botanical knowledge, I've learned so much from the names of plants. And just one example is choquum, the Saskatoon berry or service berry that botanists give one species designation to. In the Lilwet and Sletlimuk language, there's 5 or 6 different varieties recognized of the Saskatoon berry. And I was taught about those by Sam Mitchell from Hatlip. And it's just 2 examples of so many that I can think of as I listen to you speaking about the power of Indigenous knowledge that is, as David says, much broader than Western science. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that. And mentioning again, I think as everybody's mentioned, the importance of storytelling and the importance of that oral history and the knowledge that gets passed down amongst.
Can I just add something to
yes.
that, Corey? With with shutting down the burning, because they said it was dangerous, and what did they replace it with? They replaced it with pesticides, with chemicals, putting chemicals on the land to control that the plants that would have been burned. And those pesticides, are really what has destroyed so many of the plant species. That's what affected our medicinal plants that that the old women were teaching me. It also brought illness to the people. And, and that was using science to control. And and so people tend not to think about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Lorna.
Yeah, and that definitely, thanks for sharing that. That's again indicative of how everything is interconnected. You can't just do this and not expect consequences in some obvious ways, but also in some unexpected ways, and that holistic nature. So I do have some more questions here. I have to say I'm trying to read them as well, but thank you for those that have submitted some questions. One of the ones that's right at the very beginning is this idea of gratitude. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the idea or the notion that if we view the world as our relative, trees as our relatives, clams as our relatives, various other things in society as our relative, it puts a different perspective. What do you think about that notion or that idea of how do we help others understand that the world is our relative? We have Mother Earth, we have the Creator. Dr. Cjete, would you like to talk about that?
Well, thank you for that question. I think, it does come down to what we understand as deep relationship, and respect and responsibility, for the life that we have been given. And of course, these are aspects of the prayers that we say, in different languages, in different Indigenous languages. Going back to what Dr. Suzuki stated, but what is missing in Western science as a whole is the context, is the bigger picture, which many scientists are not really taught about, that contextual nature of knowledge, and which is really the foundation of Indigenous knowledge. Context is the system, that the living system that you are part of and that you live in and that gives you life and continues, life through generations. And so this whole idea of gratitude, is an ethic, that's connected to that larger systemic view, if you will. I don't like to call it a system because it's an organic living thing, really, that we're talking about. System is a very Western science word. It's very mechanical, but it conveys the idea that things are related to each other in multiple kinds of ways, and so that understanding, that deep understanding, was a foundation through which Indigenous knowledge was created and was extended over time, over generations. And it gave life to the landscapes, it gave life to the land. I'm worried, I guess, again, I'm coming back to what is happening to Indigenous communities themselves as they become more dependent on external sources for resources and for economics, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I'm truly advocating a community-based education that moves us out of the institutional. Although we use institutions as resources when appropriate, we actually take back re-empower ourselves to educate ourselves through ourselves, and through that process, really begin to enliven and adapt. We do need kind of what our ancestors have always done, which is really, because many of the plants, as Dr. Williams has said, Lorna has said, are no longer available. This is going to become more apparent. Even the soils that we farm with are changing because of climate change, because of the pesticides. And so we're going to, as Indigenous people, have to really take over that Indigenous science role once again that we were so good at doing. Our education systems are not going to do that for us. We have to begin to really empower our own communities and really home in on the idea that we have to create, that community education system once again in a way that will help us adapt and deal with the many changes that are before us and will come, as a result of climate change. And so it is about, again, sustaining and maintaining and extending, Indigenous culture and life through the next generations. And so it's really going to fall to the youth in many ways to be able to do that. From a Western curriculum standpoint, I'm also educated in that. This is very doable. It's been doable all along. Yeah, it's just, again, the systems are resisting it. They don't want it. But then we now have to work with our own communities and get them to want it and to apply it once again in ways that are appropriate. So that's my way of looking to the future, in a very direct and practical way, to say that we have to recover that deeper communal educative process that we all know that is there, has been usurped by Western education, and also find ways to use Western education to enhance that community education.
Absolutely. Yeah. Thank you for that. And again, one of the comments reminded me of the reality in the academy that, we don't see social sciences as a science, and going to what Dr. Suzuki said, that, science has been reduced to, beyond observation and beyond the actual immersion in knowing and learning all aspects, and even the diminishing of in what is considered Western science, that field science isn't that science either. So we have quite a hurdle here to overcome. One of the questions that has come up is, and of course we have a lot of non-Indigenous scholars and teachers on this call, and what are some who seem very obviously committed to this? What could a high school teacher or a non-Indigenous scholar, what could they contribute? How could they be good, genuine, authentic allies? And maybe Skye, I'll bring that to you.
Sure, thank you so much for this question. I think that one of the first things that comes to mind is what Dr. Williams was talking about earlier, in helping students build the skills of listening to the land. And I think that connects to a little bit to what Dr. Cjete was talking about too, in regard to engaging with our more than human kin, our ancestors in the natural world, with an abundance of gratitude, and watching as they kind of change with the seasons. And I think that if we're able to pick the place that we are, and if we empower students to pick the place that we are and pay attention to all of the people and more than human kin who come from that place, and approach them with a sense of responsibility. So perhaps it is the Saskatoon berry, and we watch that Saskatoon berry and we learn about the caretakers of that Saskatoon berry. I think that that's a really good place to start, to learn to kind of listen to the land and approach our more than human kin with generosity. I also think that a really important piece is to empower students to be able to contextualize themselves. So whenever we go out onto the beach, even if it's to do science, everyone who's there, regardless of their background, we gather in circle and we start by introducing not only who we are, but who we come from and who were the caretakers of the lands that we were raised on. And so I think that in this way, we're able to start to identify our own assumptions and biases, by providing students the opportunity and skills to kind of do some of that self-reflection. And I think can set the stage for being able to engage in these different knowledge systems with a deeper level of respect.
Yeah, absolutely. So that recentering of where you are and the place and space that you occupy and how you interact with that world is important. One of the comments, Dr. Williams, was about somebody really appreciated your idea when you spoke about the difference understanding between colonization and science and what that means for Indigenous teachers. For a non-Indigenous teacher, whether, let's say high school, how would you, or what advice could you give them to ensure that they, as Skye said, center themselves as non-Indigenous teachers, but with a lens or with the promotion of these different Indigenous ways of knowing and being and understandings of colonization and science?
Well, I was really happy that someone asked that question about what teachers can do, because teachers can do a lot. And I did a study when, well, it was almost 20 years ago now. And in looking at that science and the numbers of Indigenous students who were in the sciences. And it was a very consistent and limited number over a 10-year period. I'm sorry, my phone is ringing. I still have a landline, and it's far away. But one of the things that I noticed, as I was saying, it was very consistent, the number of Indigenous students who were in the hard sciences in physics, chemistry, and biology over a 10-year period. And because we have that kind of data here in BC. And so I was looking, but in looking at these numbers, I could see where the Indigenous students were coming from, like which districts. And so I started to unpack that a little bit more, and looking at the districts and where the students were coming from. And, you know, it was always consistently from certain schools, certain high schools. And when I looked some more, it was always one teacher who had taken it upon themselves to work with Indigenous students, to encourage them to, and one of the really key things that they had to do was one of the things that Indigenous people have been doing in school is they have been leaving their knowledge behind, the knowledge that they hold from their communities, from their families, from their nations. They leave it outside the school door. So one of the things that teachers have to do is to invite that knowledge in, so that students bring their wisdom, their knowledge with them, because in that knowledge there is so much, and we've always been told to leave it outside, that it isn't worth anything. And so that's one of the things that those teachers can do. The other is that the world of, you know, academia, of science, and science being one of the areas, has a thought process that is different from the thought process in the Indigenous world. And you have to be able to bring those together so they can talk together. And that's what teachers can learn to do. And the ones who, and some teachers naturally have learned to do that, and they make it happen, but it's not something that is taught when people are being prepared to be teachers. So teachers are powerful. Yes. And they can make things happen, or they can shut things down. And so we're still in a place where we're needing to learn how to be able to be respectful and to be grateful to all the different knowledges that exist in this world, that make this world a good place.
Thank you for that. And with, of course, teachers are really the ones that are educating our kids in high schools and in universities. I know for myself, when I was the only girl, let alone the only Indigenous person in my physics class, my teacher was the one that gave me the confidence to stay in that class. And of course, it also in post-secondary, we can have that difference and that effect on students. And for those teachers that are listening and who may not know how to do this, I would, you know, extract, of course, all the readings and teachings that I've done that Dr. Williams has written, is you just have to do it. You just have to go, as Sky said as well, go forward humbly with a holistic perspective, as Dr. Cjete has said as well, and just do it. And if you make a mistake, just apologize and ask what you can do better. And of course, don't present the knowledge as yours, but as, you know, identify yourself as an ally that is learning and an ongoing process. I know that goes all the way back to the very beginning of our panel when Dr. Cjete was speaking about himself being interested in art, initially field biology, but found yourself wanting to go into art, or people questioning the value of science to those that are taking arts. So there was a question around how do you incorporate, and the person acknowledges that many scientists are recognizing the importance of using art or, you know, various non-science methods to talk about or to communicate the importance of climate change and various other issues in our world. Maybe I'll go to you, Dr. Cjete. How can non-Indigenous people understand that again, the holistic nature that art and science in many ways are one, and communication discovers, or effective communication incorporates all of those ways of being and knowing.
Well, I would say I remember reading Dr. Herbert Reed back in 1935 said, art is the expression and science is the explanation of the same reality. And in terms of the scientific method actually is a spin-off of the creative process methodology that artists are very aware of. It includes first insight, immersion into, which is research, immersion into learning what you're going to do, actually creating it, and then you step back and there's the evaluation phase, showing the work that you've done. So, so for me, art, you know, I was exposed to art all of my life. I had the opportunity to have an art teacher in my day, in my elementary school, that followed me from first grade all the way to 12th grade. So every grade, you know, I had the same art teacher. And so I was influenced certainly by that. And I think it also formed my way of viewing and understanding context and the creative process. In many ways, what's essential is for would-be scientists to really begin to reattach to their creative selves. And in many ways they do. Many scientists actually also practice some form of art because it helps to balance them. Indigenous people knew this. So many times, you know, through our creation of stories and through our creation of symbols, we created also mechanisms that expanded the person's knowledge to include knowledge of plants, to include knowledge of places, to include knowledge of the stars. So it's an integrated, holistic relationship that was really being established in the context of that kind of thinking. So art matters. Art actually, the training that the mind receives, you know, as a result of creative process, allows you to apply something that is reductionist in orientation, like scientific knowledge, in creative ways. If you just focus on the reduction without the creative, the other aspects of your mind coming into it, not only are you limited, you can do some very destructive forms of science, as I think people have seen. And so, and then finally, you know, to the teachers, teachers take control of your curriculum. You have the power to create within the classroom an environment and also of openness and also the content. You're facilitators of students learning content. And so in the creation of your curriculums, you actually have a very powerful position, as Lorna has mentioned, to be able to choreograph, if you will, using dancing terms, the dance that you, your students, and the content do with each other. And so, so this is not new. A lot of teachers have done this. A lot of science teaching is doing this already. It's just that it's not well known, and it certainly doesn't come into the universities. I think the university and university science are the greatest perpetuators of not only the system as it exists, but also are in many ways responsible for the kinds of science that we are having to deal with today. So again, I really thank you for that question. I think it's an important one. There's a lot of material, even in Canada, in terms of how you actually go about doing this kind of work.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks for bringing up that it really is about relationships, not only relationships between and amongst human beings as people, but relationships amongst all of the different disciplines and different areas as well. And I've been
Right.
taught that the greatest education is connecting your head to your heart to your hands.
Right.
That's something that we all need to do. And again, the emphasis on that all the knowledge is there, the information is there. And we have only just over 5 minutes left, but one thing that does come up often in this type of work, particularly with non-Indigenous scholars or Indigenous scholars that want to study, you know, outside of their territory for whatever reason, is that appropriation of knowledge. You know, and there was some comment too about, you know, getting grants and getting, you know, whether it's NSERC or SHRC or whatnot. And you know, often they require partnership with Indigenous peoples or Indigenous communities. Do you have any suggestions on somebody who, well, first, my number one is they have to be authentic in their willingness or wanting to partner with an Indigenous person and or community and be respectful of that knowledge. But once somebody's gotten there, what are some ways to build those relationships with Indigenous scholars or to change the curriculum in a high school class, or to partner on a grant application? And maybe Sky, I'll go to you.
Sure. I mean, I think that a lot of tips have been kind of covered through today's conversation, but I think that, you know, being really genuine, finding those people like has been said many times, much of this information is out there, and there are often Indigenous scholars who are already kind of investigating areas that non-Indigenous scholars might be interested in pursuing. So I think first and foremost, trying to find where that knowledge already exists and where people are already doing that work, and connecting and upholding those folks. I think that next, making sure that you're really doing your own kind of education and learning. And so if this is a lot of work is connected to some sort of place. And so making sure that you're figuring out who the appropriate people are, who need to be kind of consenting to that work, who need to be informing that work and guiding how that work can take place in a really good way. And I think kind of pragmatically, this often means extending our timelines and expanding our budgets, because doing this work requires, if you don't have a lot of experience working closely with Indigenous communities and collaborators, it can be easy to assume that everyone works the way that you do. And in fact, when we are trying to make space for multiple ways of knowing, that often means making mistakes, having fumbles, and adapting to different priorities. And so I think that really pragmatically, we need to make sure that we're engaging with folks earlier, and from before any of this work begins. So at the outset, co-creating the vision for that grant, as opposed to kind of inviting folks to participate after your project has already been defined and the funding has already been allocated, can make sure that there's actual genuine and substantial contributions from all different ways of knowing and all individuals who are leading that work.
Thank you. And that brings me to you, Dr. Williams, and of course your R's that you've written about extensively and have been adopted, I know, by many people, the one of the R's being reciprocity. So how do you see that relationship to ensure there's no appropriation or taking advantage of Indigenous knowledge, but an actual working together to build these relationships?
Well, number one, I think that that the systems, the research systems themselves have to create the policies and the guidance for researchers to be able to do this. So in Canada, you know, our NSERC, the Tri-Council, NSERC, CIHR, and SHRC each have an Indigenous academic advising body to be able to make sure that this that the research grants themselves are constructed to be able to guide people to protect Indigenous, the knowledge of Indigenous peoples in their in on their home sites. And then the research institutions themselves, universities have to be able to create, they have to teach their people how to be able to do this, and to build it into the way in which both students and professors are doing they're carrying out their research. And to make a habit, one of the things that I just saw last week was finally someone has taken it upon themselves to create a way in which people's knowledge can be cited in academic papers. Finally, this is happening, because so many people, and Nancy's mentioned, for example, in my territory, the amazing people, Baptiste Ritchie and my uncle Sam Mitchell, who gave so much to academics. None of that knowledge ever was cited, for as their knowledge. It always then became owned by the academic who wrote it down, and so finally that's changing, and so those are the kinds of things that that we have to constantly be working on and putting into place.
Absolutely. And I mean, it's only been 20 years that Indigenous knowledge was a valid form of evidence in a court system as well, right? So, but you think the Academy would be further ahead, and that absolutely has to be a given. It's gone, again, the reciprocity you can't just take. I'll just answer one quick question there's a question about how do I include Indigenous knowledge into teaching high school physics and chemistry? I actually get this question a lot, also at the post-secondary level. You can just start by using examples. How do you think my people and Miles people put up our totem poles prior to contact? We understand levers and pulleys and whatnot. The same as chemistry. How did we tan our hides with elements that were found in nature? How also did we preserve our fish? Math as well. The concept of 0 and place value 10 originated with Indigenous people. So incorporating that knowledge is looking for those types of examples, and hopefully you've also gotten a lot of other best practices and ideas to help all of you today in your own practice of science, your own teaching of science, and your own research in science, and the idea of bringing decolonizing science education and practicing Indigenous science today. I think there's a lot of examples here, and if I was to narrow it down to one, I think it is to be humble, to be open, and to actually observe, and to pay attention to these things. So I would just really like to thank every single person that was on this panel today. Thank the people from the team that organized the Reconciling Ways of Knowing, that organized these dialogue sessions, which are, really important and really have been engaging. And thank you everybody for sharing your knowledge. And we will close today. I just got to read it here. It is, there's a song, and I'll leave it to you, Dr. Williams, to introduce the song, but it's called the Paul Dick Song.
Yeah, that's the song I mentioned to you earlier about the chief who learned from the stories of the stream. And this is a song that's always sung in our community. And it's come to be known too as our welcome song, but it's really, when you listen to the song, you can feel the voice of the stream, and it's about caring for the water that sustains us, and being grateful to it. Okay.
Thank you so much. Thank you for everyone. Gila Kasla, with great gratitude. Thank you for everything that you shared today. And I'll turn it over to Jackie.
Thank you, Corey. On behalf of Reconciling Ways of Knowing, Heit Sepka, and thank you to Corey and to all of our speakers, our conveners, and attendees for sharing your time and reflections with us today. We'll be sending out a short survey after the session. I believe Eden has dropped it in the chat. We appreciate it if you could take a few minutes to share your thoughts with us. We're planning a few more dialogues over the next few months and look forward to sharing more information about those soon. And we're pleased to announce today that our next dialogue, Conserving Cultural and Natural Heritage Through Sustainable Mountain Tourism, will be done in partnership with the Canadian Mountain Network in recognition of this year's theme for International Mountain Day, set by the United Nations, Sustainable Mountain Tourism. We'll be co-hosting this event on Thursday, December 9th at 10 Pacific, 12 Central, and 2 p.m. Atlantic. We'll be opening registration tomorrow, so if you're already on our mailing list, keep an eye on your email for more information about that event. And if you're not already on our mailing list, please go to waysofknowingforum.ca and sign up to hear more about this event and the ones we're planning for early in the new year. And don't forget to follow us on social media, on LinkedIn, Twitter, and Facebook for more updates and relevant articles. And last but not least, please donate to support our ability to bring you these dialogues. You can do so at waysofknowingforum.ca. Thank you.